Hey everybody, it's Britton here. Welcome to another episode of Conversations with. And boy, let me tell you, I am excited for this one. This filmmaker has made more Stephen King adaptations than anybody else. He's responsible for one of your favorite movies ever of your childhood, Hocus Pocus. He wrote the thing. He's had an amazing career as a musician, as a publicist, as a filmmaker, as everything. And he's got the greatest podcast on the internet. I am talking to Mick Garris today. This has been a long time coming, and I am so excited. So thank you for joining me with Conversations with Mick Garris. Let's do this. We're going to have a lot of fun. Now to Mick. Hey, hey, hey.
Hey, Britton, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Good to meet you.
It's good to meet you. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
No, it'll be fun.
You and I are very similar, and we're both musicians, and we both love horror movies.
Well, I'm a former musician, but I'll accept the appellation anyway.
There you go. You started out in music first, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I was 12 years old, I made little 8mm films and the like, but the first thing I was doing professionally in the arts, um, after having dabbled in journalism and the like, was from the time I was 18, I was in a band called Horse Feathers, yeah.
Okay, Symphony for a Million Mice came out this year. Was that a reissue, or was that got songs that you just had sitting around that you were like, we should get these out?
Well, we've never had an album before. Even though our band was active in the 70s, we did a lot of demo recording and a lot of recordings that were never released. And our keyboard player and primary composer, Bill Burney, had this huge library of hours of recordings we'd done, and took some of the best ones and started doing overdubs and freshening the original tracks and putting in new instrumentation, and then sent them down to us. He lives in Washington, and I live in Los Angeles. The other two members live near San Diego. And so in San Diego, we put in some new vocal tracks, overdubs and the like. And so we kind of made something new out of something old. And because progressive rock, which was the music my band did, was never very popular, we didn't have to work about timeliness about that.
Right.
It didn't worry about that. And so we decided to put our first album out, decades after the band existed.
Well, there you go. Better late than never, I think.
I would like to think so.
Right. Did you guys have particular musical influences as a band, or you personally?
Yeah, we did, and I did. We started out as a country rock band in the early 70s, but the longer we were together, the more sophisticated our tastes grew. So there were bands of the day like Yes and Gentle Giant and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Genesis, who were doing something. Everybody played multiple instruments, and there were time changes that were a little more provocative, and complexity in the music. Most of those bands were kind of very precious about the complexities, where we were not afraid of mocking ourselves and adding humor to the mix.
Right.
So, yeah. And of course, nobody who's ever been a musician, and I'm sure including yourself, could not be influenced by the Beatles, who changed everything.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah, everything. I mean, and they still continue to do so. I think that like a lot of modern pop song structure would not be around with that, because they completely changed the way you could write a song, along with Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison threw verse, chorus out the window, starting songs off with choruses and everything. And they really built on top of that. And I think that a lot of our adventurous structures and melodies come from back in 64, 65, 66 with all these amazing records that are still so fresh.
Yeah, and especially when it came to Sgt. Pepper, which they reinvented themselves and added orchestra and all these just kind of chapters in these songs that really, it was the first progressive rock album, I would submit.
Right. Everything is a journey. You have Day in the Life with the coolest bridge ever.
Yeah.
And stuff like She's Leaving Home, that is one of the most beautiful stories ever told.
Just magic. And they were the first real songwriter performers. There weren't bands who wrote their own songs before that.
Right. And they took it very, very, very seriously. And then, I mean, influencing people around them, from the Stones, who is another great duo that just, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, just write amazing music together.
Yeah, exactly.
is something else. I was reading online. I don't know if you put these influences forward, if it was just the article, but it talked a lot about the Grateful Dead, which I'm a huge fan of, and Little Feat, which I'm also a huge fan of, and
Yeah.
like Black Oak, Arkansas, and those kind of people. Are those people that influenced you?
Uh, a, a little bit, you know. Sometimes we would go a little rockier and travel in those places. And I got compared to Jim Dandy a lot at the time
Yeah,
for some reason in the local press. But musically, they were not quite the strong influence that the other ones I mentioned were. Um, and also our Bill Burney, who I mentioned before, he was so iconoclastic. He didn't listen to rock and roll. He listened to avant-garde classical and things like that. So a lot of the more complex things that we did were due to those influences. And
right.
yeah, and I was also a music journalist at that time, so I was exposed to an awful lot of stuff that didn't play on the radio, and
Right.
that's the stuff that excited us. Yeah.
Now, I was reading you interviewed people like Janis and Jimi Hendrix at a really, really early age. Did you have like a coolest interview or like a story that you walked away with that you're like, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened?
Well, maybe the most memorable would have been Janis Joplin. It was so emotional. This was right before she was going to play, and she was holding a bottle of Jack Daniels and had obviously drained most of it. She was in tears, talking about what a lonely life she led. You know, she was literally crying and saying, I ain't got no man. My band is my man.
Right,
And just, you know, you could feel that pain and literally tears running down her face as she's talking about the loneliness of life on the road and even off the road. You know, her career was such that she just didn't have people that she could be really close to. And it was really painful and yet really revelatory to me to be able to talk to
right,
someone who at the time she was the queen of pop and rock,
right.
and even she could not find happiness in that.
And you could hear it in the way she sings. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, she's an extremely emotive
Oh
vocalist
yeah.
and gone way too soon. Um,
Part of
27
that
is a little,
27 club, you know, she
yeah.
and Kurt Cobain and the Badfinger, Pete Ham, and all these guys.
The music industry has a way of chewing people up and spitting it out, and it's not for everybody. It's a wheel that turns really fast, and a lot of people can't keep up. And unfortunately, they're almost always the great ones. Um,
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, to be a great artist, you have to be really sensitive to the depths of your soul. And yet, to be a successful artist, you have to have the hide of a rhinoceros because you're constantly being judged, especially these days where everybody tries to be snarky online and get a bit of a, some notoriety about how bitchy they can be,
right,
complaining about somebody's looks or you're judged on the most personal aspects of who you are. So you have to be able to withstand those slings and arrows and still be able to plumb the depths of emotion to make great music, make great books, make great movies, all of that stuff.
totally. And it's funny the way railing against the system has changed, because it used to be everyone that was part of rock and roll. It was rock and roll to not dig the government or to not dig the system, the man. And now it's just whatever outlandish things that you can say about other people. I mean, how many times has Elton John insulted Madonna over and over
Right,
and over and
right.
over again? And that's the feuds that we look for. But back in the 60s, it was just, it was us against them instead of us against each other. And it's interesting the way the game has changed.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the Beatles started it with their whole social change. You know, people started wearing their hair different. They started becoming political. Um, and rock and roll came to represent rebellion,
Right.
and that's what it was all about. Then it became corporate, and it became something that was all about making money rather than expressing somebody's truest, most primal beliefs.
Right. It's the way the game works, unfortunately. But, you know, A lot of now we have a lot of people, I think, in this modern world that are very rock and roll, but aren't rock and roll at all. People like Billie Eilish, a young 18-year-old girl who's making some of the most rock and roll music that has been in the last 30 or 40 years, and she's a pop singer.
Yeah,
It's all about your attitude.
yeah,
It's something else.
it truly is. Yeah,
Now, you also interviewed back in high school. You were talking to people like Ray Bradbury and Rod Serling. Now,
yeah.
Rod, I would have died. That's something else. You were like 15 and 16 at this point,
Yeah,
weren't you?
yeah. I was in the middle of high school, and the Ray Bradbury was my first interview ever, and
Wow.
he was my god. I read everything he'd written by the time I was 13 or 14. Um, and he was sort of like an evangelist when he would give these. I met him at a speaking engagement at the college that I was going to go to a couple years after
Right.
that. And I was able to just sit down across a table from him after he had done this amazing presentation. And he was phenomenally inspiring and the like. And Rod Serling, the same thing. It was at that same college I was yet to go to. And they would have these lecture series and bring people like them in. And I would contact the school and see if I could interview him for my school paper,
Right.
and I was able to. And Rod Serling was fascinating. I asked him about his introductions and things, and he said, well, the reason I had the cigarette and that I was so clipped in my delivery is I was nervous and I used that cigarette as a prop. I was really uncomfortable speaking to the camera, and I'm a writer, and suddenly this is what I'm expected to do, and that was a prop, and that traveling to another dimension, it
Right.
was very much out of nerves was his delivery, and yet it's become iconic and fantastic.
Totally. Do you have a favorite Twilight Zone episode?
Well, To Serve Man is pretty great. Or
Right.
the monsters are here on Maple Street. Monsters are due on Maple Street, but and the Burgess Meredith one where the library and his glasses are broken.
Right.
There's a bunch of great ones.
My friend Red, who helps me out with these, is a huge Twilight Zone fan, and still to this day cannot watch the Howling Man episode
Oh,
because it chills him to his core to hear this guy howl,
oh,
and it's
it's
still
so great.
terrifying.
Yeah, and that was written by Richard Matheson, who I got to
Right.
work with. His son, Christian Matheson, and I have written scripts together, and Richard Sr. was on a round table board when we were making Amazing Stories, and I got to work with him there, and it was, he was a great man and a great writer.
Phenomenal writer. And then after journalism, you worked at Star Wars. Is there perks of being at Star Wars, working at Star Wars besides hanging out with R2D2 and all those guys?
Well, it was at the very beginning. It was on the first ones, and I was answering phones. Star Wars, may I help you?
Right.
And the biggest perk was the only time in my life I've ever been to the Oscars. I operated R2D2 on the Oscars that year in 1978. And I'm backstage with Jack Nicholson and Bette Davis and Olivia Newton-John and all these people, and Nicholson was leering at Olivia, and they were, you bet, I like that.
Right.
And it was just a phenomenal experience. And to be there in the beginning of what has become this practically 50-year-old franchise, that first it was just a movie, but it just became something outrageous. In 75, Jaws happened, and that was the first real summer blockbuster. And the second one was Star Wars, which outdid Jaws. And to be at the roots of a cultural explosion and phenomenon was really great. I was making $150 a week answering phones and doing personal appearances with R2D2.
Right.
But that experience meant far more than any living I could have made from it.
Totally. I mean, what cooler job is there to just Star Wars?
Exactly.
That's how you answer the phone. The first words out of your mouth, Star Wars.
Exactly.
Amazing. Uh, Now, before all of that, what was the first cinematic experience that you had where you were like, I love film? This changed my life.
Well, it was probably my family used to go to the drive-in all the time because there were four kids and it was too expensive to go to the movies
Right.
in a real movie theater. Um, but we'd go in the station wagon, and probably the most memorable experience I had was when I was, maybe 7 years old, and Psycho came out.
Right.
And in those days, horror films were thought to be for kids because they'd been all the I was a teenage things and
Mhm.
all the American International stuff. Horror was aimed at teenagers or younger. And so here's this incredibly adult, incredibly disturbing drama that in its day was what The Exorcist was in the 70s, just incredibly intense. And nothing had been done like it before. Horror movies all took place in Carpathian castles or,
Right.
in legends with monsters and things that you'd never find in real life. And suddenly the monster is one of us. And he's very charming and he's very relatable and he's very psychopathic.
Right.
And so that just kind of jarred my world at a very early age. And I'd always leaned toward the old Universal classics and the like, but this was something that changed everything. And I was fascinated by it. It didn't disturb me, it excited me. And
Totally.
I never knew that 30 years later I'd be directing the prequel sequel,
Right. Right. And so, I mean, building on what you said about it brings horror, it brought horror into modern times. It's closer to you. I mean, it's also the guy that runs the motel that you go stay on when you're on vacation. It's like taking, you're at your most vulnerable, or some of your most vulnerable when you're in a motel or a hotel or whatever, because you're staying in someone else's house.
Yeah.
And it's still terrifying. I still remember after I saw it when I was probably 12 or 13 when I saw it, and um, my mom scared me the next day, pulling the shower curtain open and just going for it, and it's still terrifying. I'll never forget that.
Now that's good parenting.
That's great parenting. My mom let me watch my first horror movie when I was 9, which was Nightmare on Elm Street, which
Wow.
was a big step for me.
Good for
Being
you.
a 9-year-old, and I don't know if I could have started with a better one. It's a pretty genius, really. I mean, Freddy Krueger may be the most developed horror movie villain that came out of that time. He's extremely like his past is, he speaks more than Jason and Michael Myers walking around not saying anything, and it scared the crap out of me. I'll never forget watching it for the first time at 9 years old, thinking I have found the secret.
Yeah, well, that's a great one to have started with. Yours was Freddy Krueger and mine was Norman Bates.
Yeah, two of the most iconic horror movie villains of all time. So, what was it about horror for you?
Even though I had three siblings when I was growing up, I felt very solitary. I was not a popular kid. And maybe I identified with the monster in a certain way. You feel like an outsider. You don't feel like you belong. Um, you're not a popular kid. You're not good at sports or whatever. And I've just always been drawn to the outre. My parents fought a lot and divorced right around the time I was 12 or 13 years old. And I think it was an escape that you didn't find. Sure, there were comedies and there were dramas and westerns and action movies and the like, but there was something that really pricked my imagination when it came to human monsters and otherwise monsters. The first genre movie I ever saw was Son of Kong.
Right.
Even though there was something fake about that stop motion, it was still fascinating. And this sympathetic creature that was made out of a metal skeleton and fake fur and rubber, but it came to life. And I think imagination is an important part of the development process. Most kids are really imaginative, but it's kind of beaten out of them by the real world from the outside, and you're kind of channeled into conformity in a way that my generation was kind of the first generation that broke away from following in your parents' footsteps. What they did was what you became, and we objected to that, and it's kind of fallen back that way a little bit, and I hate to see the clock going backwards.
Right, and it's moving quickly, especially in the last 4 years. What was the pivotal moment for you that was, I love horror, but what was the moment where you were like, this is what I want to do? I want to make movies.
Well, it started when I got that movie camera as a graduation present from junior high school, a little wind-up 8mm movie camera. This was even before Super 8. And so the first thing I made was The Return of the Count. It was a Dracula movie with my young friends. And that was like, wow, I can do this. I built a coffin, and I did makeup on a neighbor kid and put a fright wig on him. And, that was really exciting. And around the same time, I was writing short stories and discovering that. And they were very kind of punchline O. Henry type horror stories where, I remember The Unforgivable Sin was a suicide story that I'd written. And so combining the idea of storytelling with the visuals of a movie camera and not knowing anything about it. I didn't edit them. I shot them and edited in the camera. This shot's going to happen, and then this shot's going to happen, and then it was developed and it was done. And so combining writing with a movie camera was a revelation, and I knew that I wanted to keep doing that. Now, I didn't have the wherewithal to make movies on a real scale that people can do now with your iPhone and your iPad and your MacBook and all of that. You can make a really professional film. Well, I was a 12, 13-year-old kid doing little 8mm, 4-minute movies as long as a roll would go. So I concentrated much more on the writing than anything else. And originally, my father was a trained artist and was not able to make a go at it professionally, but I inherited some of that talent. And the first thing I did was draw. Then when I discovered writing and the movie camera, I quit drawing, and my focus went more on the writing than anything else. And then screenwriting ultimately led to the opportunity to direct. So it was ingrained in me from 12 years old on.
Totally. And then obviously that gave way into journalism. Music would go hand in hand with the writing, and then Star Wars, and then publicity. How long in between the Star Wars gig and working for Avco Embassy and Universal on the publicity front? How long was that period in between?
That was about 2 years after Star Wars. I was at Star Wars late 77 into 78. And then I started working at Avco Embassy in 1980. And I was very fortunate in the movies that they were releasing were The Howling, Joe Dante, John Carpenter doing The Fog, and David Cronenberg doing Scanners. So 80 and 81 was when I was hired to do specialized publicity in the horror and science fiction genre. So I would service the many genre magazines that existed in those days rather than the websites that represent them today. I would go to comic book conventions and sci-fi conventions and do slideshows of the movies that were coming out, show trailers, things like that, and just aim at an underserved audience. So it went beyond just newspaper ads and TV commercials. And then when the head of Avco Embassy left the company and was hired to run Universal, he brought me with him to do the same thing. And at that time, there was Videodrome and The Thing and An American Werewolf in London. So I kind of hired myself to do these making ofs while the movies were either being made or were in post-production, and I would interview the filmmakers, show clips. And then deeper in, I was hired to do it for like Gremlins and the Goonies, where there'd be an actual budget to have a crew to do these things. And that was a way I kind of taught myself how to make a narrative out of pieces of film that just were assembled on the set while a movie was being made.
So it greatly informed how you made movies, being on the set of around all of these people.
Completely, not so much on how movies were made, because so much of that takes place before you get to the set,
Right.
or you're shooting. A lot of the creative decisions are made then and discussed with all the department heads and the like. But it very much, it felt like I was let into a secret entrance into a magical club. And I could see what was happening on the set, and I could talk to the filmmakers and the actors and get their perspective about what was going on. And that was hugely valuable to me as a filmmaker in later years.
Right. David Weiner, who made In Search of Darkness, had interviewed you for In Search of Darkness. I just talked to him the other day, told him I was interviewing you, and he was like, if you haven't seen this, you need to look up Mick Garris, John Landis, John Carpenter, and David Cronenberg. And that special is brilliant.
Oh.
It's so informative. It's pretty amazing to hear, you know, those guys at the height of their career.
Yeah, their careers were just kind of taking off, and that was something I did doing publicity. You know, people who run publicity or do behind the scenes stuff or making ofs, none of them were horror fans. None of them understood the appeal of the genre and the like. And so I had the idea of bringing these three guys together who'd already proven themselves, but were really at the beginnings of the strong parts of their careers, really some of their best movies coming out at this time, bring them together. And we basically recorded that and gave that to TV stations all around the country. So it was picked up by stations, you know, and run on the 11 o'clock news. They would cut segments out, or they'd put it on at 11:30 at night after their news in toto. And it was just really great. And now that has become kind of a document of these creative people at a very specific time in their careers, but also in the world of genre filmmaking. And now it's kind of this timeless document, which is the reason I do the podcast, you know, Postmortem.
Right, which is brilliant. I listen all the
time.
I love it. And, you know, I was driving around probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, listening to the episode you did as a tribute to Wes Craven, and then you played his episode he did with you when you were filming Postmortem 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And Wes is a filmmaker that his, obviously, Nightmare on Elm Street, and all of these movies were very early on for me watching horror, and, you know, a huge loss to the genre, which, you know, this allows me to segue into this. Another huge loss for the genre, who you love, and who I'm very dear friends with Caroline Williams. And when I told her I was interviewing you, she told me how much it meant to her, of how supportive you were after Tobe Hooper died. And I'd love to just talk a little bit about Tobe and what your draw to him personally and as an artist was.
Well, Tobe was a very dear friend and somebody who meant a lot to me. I had first met him on the set of Poltergeist. I was doing publicity on that, and then later helped Frank Marshall do the Poltergeist documentary, did some interviews with Stephen for it. And Tobe was one of the sweetest people in the world. He introduced himself to me because he recognized me from my Z Channel interview show that I did, that he used to watch all the time, kind of the precursor to Postmortem. Tobe had the biggest heart and was the sweetest teddy bear of a guy, very sensitive guy. And we got to be really good friends. And when it came time to doing Masters of Horror, he was one of the first people I asked and said yes right away. What was special about Tobe was not just the size of his heart, but also his boundless creativity. A lot of filmmakers in and out of the genre will have a big success, and their movies stay the same that way. They don't evolve, they don't grow, they don't enhance their knowledge. But Toby was always questing, and I always say this about him: he was like a 25-year-old filmmaker. You know, he had a huge heart, and he loved to scare people. But he always wanted to try something new. He was always aware of the tools of movie making and new equipment and new lenses and new techniques and digital technology and all of that. And it excited him. He went into every project excited. And that's incredibly inspirational. And the crew and the cast would have to be inspired by that as well. So Toby was a very sweet guy, and his death was a huge loss and a painful loss. And I was glad to be able to do that tribute to Toby with Carolyn. And because I was on the set of Poltergeist, and I saw the issue that everybody talks about, who directed it, Stephen or Toby. And frankly, they both did. And they both had a lot to do with it. Stephen was a very strong producer, and it was Toby's first big studio movie. So they collaborated in a very strong way. And it was great to be able to talk about that with Bill Moseley and with Carolyn on that episode of Postmortem. So it was nice.
People don't realize how sophisticated of a filmmaker he actually was. I mean, even looking at the difference in between Texas Chainsaw Massacre and one of my favorites, Eaten Alive.
Oh, yeah.
The journey, he's a really sophisticated filmmaker. And I think that people were expecting the Texas Chainsaw Massacre guy to make Poltergeist. And he was finally given a budget that was worthy of his talent. And he got to make a big movie. And it's pretty brilliant. Now, we have to talk a little bit about the greatest work that you've ever done, Fuzz Bucket.
Well, let's just call it the first work I got paid for to direct.
It's pretty great. I'm not sure how, when I was a kid, I don't know if someone had it on DVD, because I know it was put out on DVD a little while ago, or if it was aired again, I don't know how, but I saw it when I was a kid, and I rewatched it, and I'm like, I remember this, and it's pretty, it holds up really well. I mean, I think that a lot of kids still share in that experience. And was that something that you wrote and directed it? Did you set out intentionally to do something for kids first, or were you approached by Disney to do something, or how did that come about?
Well, it had an interesting background. The story, I originally pitched it to Steven Spielberg on Amazing Stories, and it was called Mikey's Buddy. And, you know, Amazing Stories was a family-oriented show, but it was not like Disney-fied. And Steven didn't really respond to it. So Disney was trying to get me to sign an exclusive contract with them as a writer, because I'd been on Amazing Stories and I'd worked with Spielberg, and they thought it would be the right sensibility. So they offered me a Disney Sunday movie, which was the brand new version of their Disney Wonderful World of Disney. So they said, you know, we would love to give you a directing opportunity for us if you sign with us. Well, I didn't sign an exclusive deal with them, but I did pitch that story idea to them, and they thought it would be perfect for that. So I wouldn't have been able to make it if not for the goodwill of John Landis. As I was meeting with Jeffrey Katzenberg about doing a deal with them, Landis walked down the corridor, and Jeffrey ran out of the office, said, "Hang on a second." He came back in and said, "I'd like to offer you to direct a Disney Sunday movie. I just talked to John Landis and said, would you executive produce it in case Mick fucks it up?" And so, and John, who has been a friend of mine for many years, agreed to do it and said, "Don't fuck it up."
Right.
So I said, "I'll try not to." So it became a Disney movie after being rejected by Amazing Stories.
Well, that's quite a good trajectory. So after that, we finally have arrived in Horrorville. You did Freddy's Nightmares after that, and Critters 2 in the same year, right? Were those at the same time?
88, yeah. I had done Critters 2 first. You know, I think the first Critters had a very Spielbergian vibe about it.
Right.
And when they were doing Critters 2, they were looking for a director. And the writer who had done the original script said, "This is it, I'm done. It doesn't need any more work." And New Line thought, "Well, we think it does need a little more work." So they went to me because now I had directed something. And they knew I worked a lot with Spielberg and thought maybe some of that would rub off, and gave me the opportunity to do the rewrite, things that they wanted changed and things that I wanted to bring into it. And so it was my first opportunity. You know, I'd gotten sent a lot of scripts to look at as possible directing, but usually those considerations end up going nowhere. But in this case, it was a greenlit movie. They came to me with an offer, and I had turned down things that looked too big for my lack of experience, like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. They talked to me about the possibility of directing that, and it wasn't an offer, but it was a possibility. And this, I thought, well, it's a little low budget movie. I could do it. Now, everything that's difficult about making movies is in Critters 2, but none of the budget.
Right.
So there's kids and practical effects and creatures and makeup effects and optical effects and all of those things, plus a lot of night shooting on location and action scenes. So it was incredibly difficult, especially for a first feature. But it ended up being something that I think I brought my personality to, and something that, even though it was not successful until it hit video, totally flopped in the theaters, was my first opportunity to direct a feature film. And I like to think that I left the traces of my personality in that movie.
It's great. We watched it on Easter. Obviously, it's the greatest Easter horror movie ever made. We watched, Easter night. We were like, what do we watch? And we were like, oh, it makes sense. Critters 2. The guy in the Easter bunny suit is amazing. And so, back to Psycho. Psycho 4.
Yeah.
There has to be some pressure there, right? Because of how much you loved the original Psycho. And now they say, here you go. Give him his origin story. What is that like?
Well, the good news was that Joseph Stefano, who had written the script for the original Psycho, wrote the script for Psycho 4. And it was being done for Showtime, although it was released theatrically in other countries. There was a bit of a buffer. There'd been Psycho 2 and there'd been Psycho 3. And it had been 30 years since the original Psycho. And it was for Showtime, which at that time was not nearly as big as HBO. And, you know, you could, if it didn't do well, people wouldn't notice. And then if it did do well, they'd say, hey, you should see this.
Right.
So we were able to kind of do it in the dark without people noticing that much. But the script was really good. And to be able to work with Tony Perkins was an honor. It was my first movie star movie I'd ever made. And that's another side of directing that you don't know until you have that experience of how to be a guidance counselor and a cheerleader and a psychologist all at the same time. And Tony was a very complex personality. Tony had directed Psycho 3, which was very unsuccessful, and he wanted to direct Psycho 4, but the studio said no. And so instead, here's an actor who's been directed by Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles and William Wyler and all these great filmmakers, and they've hired the director of Critters 2. So I can see how he might have some resistance to that. And he did, and he constantly tested me while we were making the film to make sure I wasn't just setting up pretty shots, but that I actually had motivation that was dramatic in origin and character-based and the like. So, you know, we had some complicated moments during the production of it, but it ended up really well. It did well for Showtime. The reviews were very mixed. The worst review I've ever gotten in my life was, you remember the bad ones really well.
Right.
Director Garris is to Hitchcock what Peoria is to Paris. So that was, but it's a really good one.
it well crafted, but I think it's a great movie. Now I have to ask, because I see Norman as a victim.
Yeah.
Is Norman in Psycho 4 a victim or a villain?
Well, I think he's a victim who becomes a villain. I think most villains at some time in their lives become victims. And I think that's at the root of their villainy. Yeah, your better nature is supposed to override those feelings that cause you to kill. And in Psycho 4, I think he's much more sympathetic because of things we show what caused all of that. So yeah, he's a victim, but yeah, he was a potential killer, but we kept him from doing it on this one. You know,
Right.
he was able to, his better nature was able to come through and supersede those homicidal leanings that he'd experienced before. And maybe it was that time in the institution that helped him reach that, and with his wife, her input into his life. But ultimately, it's the victory of humanity over villainy.
Right. And I think that the film is handled so beautifully. I think all of the Psycho movies they took really good care of their franchise. I like 3.
Yeah.
2 is awesome. I love 2. They took really good care of it. And so you went from one incest movie to another incest movie.
Don't tell my mother. Yeah.
Right. Don't tell your mom.
One day there will be a 3rd chapter in the trilogy, I guess.
In your incest trilogy. It's going to be amazing. And we're looking forward to it. Now, Sleepwalkers is my favorite one of your movies. I love that movie. There's a big tonal difference in both Psycho 4 and Sleepwalkers. And aside from, like, obviously different writers, different source material, it's the coloring is different, the shots are different, the way that the choices, the acting choices, it's a very tonally different movie. Was that something that you set out to do, to make sure, like, oh, these are these 2 movies that incest is a big plot, let me differentiate them as hard as I can, or did it just end up being that way?
Well, it wasn't a divide, an intentional thing. Like, I don't want to get this motherfucking movie like that motherfucking movie.
Right.
But there was a different attitude about it. It's a lot more what Stephen King would refer to as a drive-in movie. You know, it was a monster movie, and it was playful, and it really went for the throat. You know, there's a lot of thoughtfulness in Psycho 4. There's a lot of drama in Psycho 4. And even in Sleepwalkers, I try and play that drama and keep it real and grounded and the like, because it is a monster movie about cat people.
Right.
But it's a more aggressive movie. You know, it is propulsive in ways that Psycho 4 was contemplative. You know, Psycho 4, we're going between the past in the 50s and the 40s and the 50s into the present. And so there's kind of a grandiosity about the past, and looking at something through the screen of memory is different than looking through it today. This, we wanted it to be very contemporary, very propulsive, very aggressive, a lot of fun, and really aimed at a different audience. These were monsters. They were creatures that were created by a creature designer. And we really wanted to go for the throat. And it's funny because the studio head who was there when we started the movie said, well, as long as I'm head of this studio, there's never going to be a movie about a boy having sex with his mother. Halfway through production, he got fired. So he was right.
Right.
Yeah, we really wanted to embrace it. We wanted to break taboos, and you know, Stephen King had a lot of fun writing the script, you could tell. And it was we didn't have to pay respect to a book or a short story or anything. This was written entirely for the screen, and it was the first time he'd done that. And so we just had a blast with it. But you ground it in performances like Alice Krieger, who's so great as Mary Brady.
Right.
And Tanya, you know, Mädchen Amick and Brian Krause and Ron Perlman and all these wonderful actors who ground it, but are able to let it go expansive and get a little bit bigger than life.
Right. Mädchen Amick may be my ultimate celebrity crush ever. I saw her first in Sleepwalkers, then in Twin Peaks, which I think may be the greatest television show ever created because David Lynch is brilliant.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was Sleepwalkers was the first time I saw her, and I was like, who is this person, and what else have they done? And I think that may be how I discovered Twin Peaks, was me trying to find everything that Faye Shinemic has done.
You're a completist. Yeah.
I'm a completist. Now, you went from Sleepwalkers, incest movie, and then you wrote Hocus Pocus.
Yeah. Well, I wrote Hocus Pocus before.
Yeah.
Hocus Pocus was written 8 years before it was produced.
Wow.
And there were 11 other writers on it after me. But it ended up being going back to what I had originally done with the producer, David Kirshner. And yeah, we knew it was a Disney movie. The Disney's name was going to be in the title. They had the title. It was Disney's Halloween House when I wrote it.
Right.
And so, you know, that's part of me as well. That 12-year-old child still lives in me. And, you know, I was brought up on Disney movies too. Right. And it still lives there. I mean, once I got ensconced into the world of the horror genre, which goes much darker than that, I was still able to bring a lot of that into Hocus Pocus. And the main difference between the movie that was made and what I wrote is that the characters were 12 years old rather than 16 years old.
Right.
Because I thought that's when Halloween really has the most impact on your life, is when you're in that change between childhood and adolescence. Right. 16-year-olds are usually stealing the 12-year-olds' candy. So
right.
But yeah, it was a lot of fun doing that and knowing it was going to be for a family audience. So was Amazing Stories. So it wasn't something new to me, but Amazing Stories was the reason I got hired to do Hocus Pocus. And
it's pretty dark. It is really dark. I mean, like, was there ever like any pushback? Like, now listen, we don't know if we can run over a cat and show its flattened body in the street and hang these witches and burn them and suck the life out of children. But
yeah,
we'll try.
It was always pretty dark from Kirshner's original conception, but my script was darker than the movie, I can guarantee you that. But one of the reasons they brought in other writers was to bring in comedy. Neil Cuthbert was a comedy writer who amped up the jokes and the like.
Right.
The structure is pretty much what I had written and from David's original idea. But mine is darker.
There you go. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't watch it when I was a kid because it freaked me out. I don't know how I was like
Elm Street, but not Hocus Pocus.
Right, and then I think that like that was my turning point where I was like, oh, now I'm doing adult movies from here on out. These Nightmare on Elm Streets and Halloweens and all that kind of stuff. Now Disney Plus is obviously back around, and they're creating original content. Do you know if there's anything for a sequel to Hocus Pocus, or more importantly, Fuzzbucket?
Well, I can guarantee you there's no sequel to Fuzzbucket.
Oh, darn.
There is a sequel in the works to Hocus Pocus. I'm not involved in it, but you know, it's been for years. They keep saying it's coming, it's coming. I think it's going to have its home on Disney Plus, because for a while they were talking about doing it on ABC Family, which became Freeform, which did that big 25th anniversary special on Hocus Pocus. But I think they're well into it, not into production, obviously, because nobody is at this point. But I think they've settled on a script. They've got a director. And so I think they're waiting to be able to hit the boards with it. So and the original cast, which is the most important element of it. I think without that, it ain't Hocus Pocus anymore.
No, not at all. That's my personal fear with the new Scream movie that they're going to make, is if Kevin Williamson isn't writing and Wes Craven isn't directing, is it a Scream movie? But I'm sure they'll do it well. The people they have signed on are really more than adequate. So I think it'll be good.
I always hope for the best.
Yes, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. Now, with Stephen King, you've had an amazing relationship. And I'm sure you've gotten a bunch of questions, so I won't dwell on The Stand too much. But did you ever think that we were going to be living in a time with so many correlations to work that you did 26 years ago?
It's pretty incredible and shocking and surprising, especially because we've found an administration that doesn't know how to handle it, that
Right.
resembles the administration, the military, as they were represented in our version of The Stand, to see it completely beyond the capability of the president that's handling it all. Not to get too political, but it just makes me sick and disgusted to see this handled that way. But to see evacuated freeways, to see stores, shopping malls, all these things closed down that we had to do when we were making the movie, where, you know, you've got a closed down section of a freeway, but behind me and the camera, there is a mile of cars honking and trying to, when are you opening up? Yeah, all of that. So, but it's very weird to see how much like it. Now, obviously, the biggest difference is that in The Stand, Captain Trips kills off 90%, 99% of the human population. And here, it's a tiny, tiny fraction that die and even are infected. But it's still a hugely humane problem. And that's the point of making The Stand the way we did, was through the eyes of really complicated, believable characters. And the human toll it takes, more than, you know, the sci-fi horror elements of it. They're the MacGuffin, but it's the destruction of society that was important to represent. And it was great. I talk about this a lot, about The Stand. My favorite thing about it was the opportunity to be a patriot again, that the right has stolen patriotism as their property. And it's not. The groundwork of our nation was created by progressives who wanted a society of equals.
Right.
All men are created equal. And that includes every gender and ethnicity and political view and social view, all of that stuff. And so that's what that movie's heart is to me.
Right.
You know, when Gary Sinise runs out of the facility, he's escaped from everyone who's dead, jumps over the wall, lands on his back in a field of grass, looks up, and there's the American flag waving over him. Right. It's the opportunity to reclaim what the birth of our nation was all about.
Right. It's absolutely beautiful, and the new Blu-ray is gorgeous.
I couldn't be happier about that. I never thought it would happen because it would be very expensive. We finished it on standard definition video, and it was never finished on film or in HD. So they had to go back to the negative and reconform everything, retransfer everything, recolor time everything. And they did. It's better than it has ever looked, and I couldn't be happier.
It is really, really gorgeous. Just a few more I got to know. With you, you're very faithful with The Stand and your adaptations, and all of your King adaptations, you're very faithful. Obviously, Stephen King hating Kubrick's The Shining.
He did.
And then you getting to helm The Shining. Was there a pressure on yourself that you put on, like, I got to get this right because I know how much Kubrick's version upset him because it's a totally, completely different thing?
Yeah.
Is there pressure?
Well, self-imposed, really. When I saw the Kubrick Shining a couple of days before it was released, and I'd never been looking forward to a movie more in my life. This great filmmaker and the greatest horror novel ever. And not just horror, but a great novel. And it broke my heart. I thought it was awful. And people don't remember that in 1980-81, almost every review of The Shining was terrible. But it became iconic. And it's that father-son, troubled father-son relationship that I think a lot of young people felt akin to. There was a kinship there, and they felt that. But I later realized it's a great Kubrick film and a bad King adaptation.
Right.
So in a way, I was naive about it. I didn't think about everybody's going to compare us to this classic, iconic Kubrick film. But I thought, yeah, we're going to do the real Shining, the story that King wrote that was motivated by his own personal experience, that was very personal to him about feeling the pressure of a family that could be easily frayed, and how alcoholism made him feel violence toward his own poor young son whose arm he broke in a drunken rage. Those things are really human and personal to King and to me as a reader of that book and someone who loved the book so much. And, as storytellers, King and Kubrick could not be more different. King is very warm and human and emotional,
Right.
and Kubrick is very cool and clinical and detached from the outside looking in. And King looks out from the inside. And that's something that I would like to think that is my raison d'etre when I'm making films as well, is just like when you're directing an actor only knows from the inside out what he's doing. And I can tell them on the outside in if it's going the way they intend. So to be able to be inside and outside was something important, particularly in that project, because there's only really 3 characters in the movie for the bulk of it. And the intimacy of that is what that story is all about. And it's really the metaphor of that boiler in the basement that's going to blow. That's Jack Torrance, and that's who he is. And the ending means a lot more than that Twilight Zone ending that Kubrick's film has.
Right. And was redeemed by Dr. Sleep, finally.
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty great.
And it uses a lot of things from the Kubrick Shining that, there was a lot more pressure on Mike Flanagan than on me, I think, because King had written the screenplay himself for our miniseries.
Right.
And so that made a huge difference too.
Well, it's pretty great. 2 most recent works I want to talk about real quick. Nightmare Cinema, which is awesome. And you just had a book come out.
Yeah.
These Evil Things We Do. Fangoria put it out, right?
Yeah. It just came out 2 days ago.
Wonderful. Now, Nightmare Cinema first, that was obviously probably inspired by Masters of Horror, I'm assuming.
Completely, yeah.
And you filmed in South Pasadena, which my 2 best friends own a shop there on Mission, just right down from the Michael Myers house and around the corner from the Rialto.
Yeah.
South Pasadena is like the horror capital around here for Midwestern little, scenery.
Including Fuzzbucket.
Fuzzbucket was South Pasadena?
Fuzzbucket was South Pasadena as well.
There you go. Now, you've contributed more to the South Pasadena legacy in the horror world. It's a pretty amazing thing. And your short at the end of the film is creepy as hell.
Oh, good.
It really is. And when we were watching it, I was quarantining with 2 of my friends, and I had it was really late, and I had fallen asleep on the couch like in the first 30 minutes because I was exhausted. And my friend stayed up alone and watched it, and he texted me, and I woke up to a text, and it says, "This is the creepiest thing ever. I'm going to kill you for making me watch this alone." And it was yours specifically. It's pretty amazing. Was that something that you wrote for Nightmare Cinema, or you just had sitting around?
I had originally written it for a 3rd season of Masters of Horror that never happened. So it was a 1 hour. And then I liked the idea so much, I turned it into a feature screenplay, a 90-minute movie. And the original concept for Nightmare Cinema was to do it as a series of low-budget feature films under the umbrella, Nightmare Cinema presents so-and-so and so-and-so. So I've written 3 of the feature scripts for that. And originally, I had adapted one of my stories, Tyler's Third Act, to be my script for my story of Nightmare Cinema. And the producers had read Dead, that feature script.
Right.
And they said, do you think you could compress that? Because we think that would be a killer ending for the movie. And so I thought, well, let me see. I'll yank out all of the unnecessary viscera and leave what's in there. And it's kind of my favorite kind of subgenre is that emo horror where it's really emotionally based.
Right.
And it goes into the heart as well as the psyche. And so I took that and kind of melted it down to its pure essence and made that work. And I'm so glad it works for it.
It's brilliant. My last question for you is the last line in Riding the Bullet, which is a wonderful psychedelic trip, is Nobody lives forever, but we all shine on. Obviously, referring to John Lennon.
Yeah.
As artists, we're always creating work that will outlive us and our children and our children's children, and it will last for generations. And you've accomplished so much. Do you ever feel driven by legacy, or is legacy an afterthought for you?
I think it's got to be an after effect. I never want to be self-conscious about the work and aiming to do something other than tell the best story that I can in the best way that I can. And the fact that you leave a trail of work behind you when you leave the planet is something that I never think about, but I'm so glad that there are things that I can leave behind that matter to people. And some of those things are conversations, like we're having this conversation, leaving behind a conversation with Tobe Hooper, or with John Carpenter, David Cronenberg, and John Landis, or Wes Craven, or Stuart Gordon, or these people who've left us. That is kind of the most important legacy to me, is being able to have respectful conversations where they talk about things that they don't normally talk about in a publicity interview or something. And more than my own work, which, I'm very proud of what I've done, and I'm very fortunate to have been able to make a career of this that continues. Being able to have been to facilitate these conversations with people who mattered, that may be the most important thing that I feel I've done.
Thank you so much for all you do. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. And stay in touch. I really appreciate it.
Send me your address and I'll send you a Horse Feathers CD.
I would love that. I'll email it to you. Thanks so much for doing this.
All right. Take care. Thanks a lot.
Right.
Stay safe.
You too. You as well.